The fall of the Soviet Union, the end of a superpower. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one of the most remarkable events of the 20th century, redefining global politics and marking the end of the Cold War. Once a dominant global superpower that rivaled the United States, its sudden disintegration stunned the world. How did a nation that spanned 15 republics collapse so dramatically? And why is it still relevant today? In this video, we'll unpack the factors behind the Soviet Union's downfall, explore the key events leading to its dissolution, and examine the enduring impact on global affairs. To understand the Soviet Union's collapse, we must first look back at its origins. Formed in 1922 after the Russian Revolution of 1917, the USSR was established as a federal socialist state. Its territories included Russia and 14 other republics, stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. The founders envisioned it as a model of communist ideology, with the government controlling all aspects of society, from industry to agriculture. In its early years, the Soviet Union was marked by rapid industrialization under Joseph Stalin, albeit at enormous human cost. By the mid-20th century, it had grown into a global superpower, playing a pivotal role in the Allied victory during World War II. However, beneath the image of strength and unity, cracks in the system were already forming. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union projected itself as an equal competitor to the United States. It maintained a vast military, launched the first man into space, and extended its influence through satellite states in Eastern Europe. Yet, much of this facade was built on a fragile economic foundation. Unlike market economies in the West, the Soviet economy was centralized, with the government managing all production and trade. While this model allowed for rapid mobilization of resources during wartime, it struggled to adapt to peacetime needs. Production quotas led to inefficiency, shortages, and waste. Essential goods, from food to consumer items, were often scarce. By the 1980s, widespread stagnation made it clear that the system was failing to meet the needs of its people. As the Soviet economy faltered, calls for reform grew louder. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, ushering in a new era of change. A pragmatic reformer, Gorbachev recognized that the status quo was unsustainable. His policies would prove transformative, but also deeply destabilizing. One of Gorbachev's key reforms was glasnost, meaning openness. This policy allowed previously suppressed discussions of government corruption, inefficiency, and past abuses. While intended to rebuild trust, glasnost exposed deep flaws within the Soviet system. Citizens began to demand greater freedom and accountability, and calls for change soon evolved into calls for independence in some republics. Another major reform was perestroika, or restructuring, which aimed to revitalize the stagnant economy. It introduced limited market-oriented reforms, such as allowing small private businesses. However, the transition was chaotic and poorly managed. Workers and factory managers, accustomed to state control, struggled to adapt, and economic conditions worsened in the short term, fueling widespread frustration. While domestic reforms unfolded, the Soviet Union also faced external pressures, particularly from the United States. Its economy was devastated by years of competing in the costly arms race. The Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars, further escalated military spending, forcing the USSR to allocate vast resources to defense at the expense of civilian needs. The strain was unsustainable. As food shortages intensified and living standards declined, the Soviet populace grew increasingly restless. Faith in the communist ideology that once united the nation was fading, replaced by cynicism about government leadership. Open dissent began to spread, creating an atmosphere of political and social instability. The Soviet Union's influence extended far beyond its own borders, controlling a vast sphere of satellite states in Eastern Europe. By the late 1980s, however, cracks began to emerge in the Soviet bloc. Long-suppressed anti-communist sentiment erupted into mass protests, starting in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. In 1989, one of the most powerful symbols of Soviet dominance crumbled, the Berlin Wall. Its fall signaled not only the reunification of Germany, but also the symbolic end of the Iron Curtain. This event inspired other Eastern European countries to break free from Soviet influence, accelerating the USSR's unraveling. While Eastern Europe broke away, nationalist movements surged within the Soviet Union itself. Long-simmering tensions between Moscow and its constituent republics boiled over as nations like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia demanded independence. National pride and cultural identities, suppressed for decades, now emerged as powerful forces pulling the USSR apart. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were at the forefront of the movement for independence. Through nonviolent resistance and mass protests, these republics challenged Soviet authority, openly defying Moscow's rule. Their success emboldened other republics to follow suit. In a final bid to preserve the Soviet Union, conservative communist leaders attempted a coup in August 1991. They sought to overthrow Gorbachev and roll back his reforms. However, their efforts failed spectacularly. Mass protests erupted, and Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, emerged as a prominent leader, rallying support against the coup. The event severely weakened Gorbachev's authority and further divided the nation. Yeltsin's defiance during the coup solidified his position as a key political figure. As the leader of the Russian Federation, Yeltsin advocated for more autonomy for Russia and the other republics, ultimately accelerating the Soviet Union's collapse. By the end of 1991, Yeltsin had effectively taken control of political power. The coup's failure marked the last gasp of a crumbling union. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met to sign the Belavesia Accords, effectively dissolving the Soviet Union. By December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR, declaring the nation's existence officially over. Its 15 republics became independent countries. In the immediate aftermath, 15 new nations emerged from the former Soviet Union, with Russia as the largest successor state. Each country faced unique challenges in transitioning from decades of centralized control to independence. Economically, many struggled with high inflation, unemployment, and political corruption. The fall of the Soviet Union reshaped international relations. With one superpower gone, the United States emerged as the dominant global force, beginning an era of unipolar geopolitics. NATO expanded eastward, and former Soviet states had to navigate relationships with both Russia and the West. The dissolution also triggered debates on sovereignty and the balance of power, issues that remain relevant today. Russia, under Yeltsin and later under Vladimir Putin, sought to re-establish its influence globally, often clashing with the West on issues like NATO expansion and regional security. Modern Russia's policies, including its role in conflicts like Ukraine, are deeply tied to the legacy of the Soviet Union's collapse. The Soviet Union's downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexible governance, economic inefficiency, and resistance to reform. It illustrates the importance of adapting to change and responding to the needs of the people. The fall of the Soviet Union was more than the collapse of a superpower. It was a turning point that altered the course of history. It ended the ideological rivalry of the Cold War, but also unleashed new tensions in its wake. As we reflect on this momentous event, we are reminded of the enduring impact of decisions made decades ago and the lessons they hold for the future of global politics.